This is Project Management Paradise.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Project Management Paradise podcast, your passport to project success. I'm your host, Aaron Murphy, and today this is a bonus episode of the podcast where we listen back through some of the key points from our interviews over 2024. Highlights include hand-picked insights into empathetic leadership, organizational change, time management skills, and how to deal with a narcissist in the workplace. In this first episode clip, I was joined by leadership guru and author Neil Frick to explore empathy in leadership. In this clip, I asked Neil, what was the most surprising aspect of empathetic leadership? And what surprises you most or might surprise our listeners about the field of empathetic leadership?
Honestly, probably how easy it is. It's really not complicated. It's just taking an extra couple of steps to ask a few questions. More often than not, customers want to tell you how to solve their problem because they're looking for a solution. Employees want to tell you what they need because they need it and they want to continue to work for you and they want to figure out a way to contribute. Most people, and not all, but most people want to be productive and they want to be successful. And, the people that don't, you're never going to change them. And that's something that you can also discover through these conversations. It's really not complicated. It feels like when we wrote the book, I kind of felt like, well, this could be like 3 pages long. It's really not that complicated. Our editors wouldn't let us go that short, but we really did just. It's a core concept of understand somebody else, understand where they're coming from. We do it in our personal lives every day. With slight modification, you can bring it to your professional life, and it makes a huge impact. You just have to be mindful and thoughtful about it when you talk to someone, and then follow through on what you promise and what you say that you're going to deliver.
In this next clip, I was joined by the CEO of Remarkable and author, Dr. Randy Ross. I asked Randy, how can we eliminate toxic elements such as stress from the workplace? And he adds how we can infuse hope instead. And in your opinion, how can you eliminate toxic elements from the workplace, such as stress?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we really can't do for people is to eliminate the stress. I think that's a misnomer. Stress is always going to be present, and stress is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you think about it, right here near Atlanta, Georgia, we have a big lake called Lake Lanier, and it feeds the Chattahoochee River, which then supplies water to communities downstream. Well, there's a huge dam on Lake Lanier that holds the water back. And that's not a problem. The dam constantly has stress on it. And that stress is fine as long as the structural integrity of the dam is not compromised, right? But if that dam begins to leak or has fissures in it, then it becomes problematic. Stress is a part of daily life. Stress can elevate performance, but stress for the long term can have negative consequences that can be anywhere from mild daily anxiety to severe acute depression. And so I think what we have to do is we have to infuse the workforce with hope. Now, hope is one of those things that I write about because there's a distinct link between hope and happiness. And we talked about the number one thing that most people want in life is happiness. But the challenge is, how do they reach it? How do you attain happiness? That's the big challenge. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that. But as workers, I think that as leaders, we have to help our workers be able to respond by adopting an attitude and a mindset that's much more resilient. That when they do face challenging times, be that change, because I know change management is a big part of what you talk about with your listeners, how can we help them navigate those difficult, tumultuous times? And hope, to me, if you understand it and if you embrace it and you apply the principles that help people elevate their hope, it can make a significant difference in the way that they come to work. And so here's kind of an interesting turn. I like to say that there are a lot of organizations that use people to grow the business. But the best organizations use the business to grow people, who then in turn grow the business. And so I think the best organizations are the organizations that invest heavily in their people to help them grow acquire the skills, the knowledge, the emotional stability that they need to face the future effectively. And by so doing, what they're doing is they're increasing their bench strength, and they're actually raising up a whole workforce that then is more powerful as they move together to accomplish whatever task is before them. And so the opportunity that we have as leaders is to create that environment where people are resilient, where they're growing, and they're bringing the best of who they are to the table.
In this next clip, I was joined by lawyer and high conflict negotiator Rebecca Zung. I asked Rebecca, how can we define what is a narcissist and what are the various types we should be on the lookout for in the workplace? Can you define a narcissist for anyone who's not sure how to define it?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because it's not just a person who wants to just look at themselves in a mirror all day long, or a person who says great things about themselves. It's in fact, it's quite the opposite of a person who thinks highly of themselves. It's actually the person who feels the most pain, the most shame, who thinks actually the least of themselves. And it's like they have a black hole within themselves. And so they have to get all of their feeling of value from external sources all the time. And so that's why the people around them end up feeling completely and utterly depleted. And yet that person is almost like they're still starving. It's like they're constantly trying to feed this deep black hole inside of them. It's almost like as if you have a toothache and all you can think of is your own pain and your own shame, your own feeling of need. And that's why they don't have empathy for anyone else. Because if you just have your own pain, all you can think about is your own pain all the time. But they live, it's like this constant feeling of survival. It's constant survival all the time. It's this most scarcity mindset that you can get into. And it is a spectrum. I mean, we all have some aspects of it at times, and sometimes worse than others. Like if you're feeling sick or you're feeling low or you're feeling, in that feeling of impatience or whatever. But it's narcissistic personality disorder is an actual disorder. So it's like that would be the end of the spectrum.
And you mentioned that there's many different types. Is there ways of actually distinguishing them from just like your everyday interactions by any chance?
Yes, of course. So this is a person who starts off a relationship with what they call love bombing or conditioning or idealization. And so they come on very charming, very personable, very immediately kind of overwhelming, taking you over. And it's almost like that too good to be true, because they use mirror neurons to become like the perfect person for you. They really are very good at reading people. So they read what you would perceive to be perfect almost immediately. But you do probably see red flags at the beginning because maybe their stories don't add up, or something doesn't really quite match up. But they're very good at kind of batting away any of those red flags almost right away. And then, but they want to get to level 2 right away, like where they kind of lock you in, lock you down, whether it's in a professional setting or personal setting. It's sign the contracts or move in with you or get you into that place where you almost are sort of in bed with them, so to speak, or moved in with them, or in a partnership or whatever it is, so that now they can kind of breathe. Now they can kind of relax a little bit. And when you get to that next level, that's when you start to see their true colors coming out. And that's when they start to devalue you. Now you'll start to see them, the wheels start to come off a bit. Now they'll start to know you're not getting the 100 phone calls a day or the 5,000 texts. And now you're not going to see how, oh my gosh, you're so amazing all the time. It immediately, the wheels start to come off.
That just kind of reminded me of Goffman's theory, where he believed people were wearing a mask on stage. So they're portraying this character for everyone to love. And then behind the scenes, that's when the real mask comes off and that real person kind of shines. So they're nearly like building this dependency. They want you to be dependent on them. And then that's where they just take you in. And then that's when their true selves come out. In the following clip, I spoke with Steve Kershaw, a global government defense leader for PwC. During this clip, Steve reveals what it was like living and working in a submarine during his time with the Royal Navy. I don't think I've ever had anyone on the podcast or even spoke to anyone outside of the podcast who has like worked in a submarine. For anyone who might not know what that's like, maybe you could tell us a bit about what it's like to actually live and work in a submarine. I'd imagine it's very different to being on the surface.
Yeah, it's a strange way to make a living, but very rewarding. I certainly found it very rewarding. So I was on both nuclear submarines and a diesel submarine. I was on our last ever diesel submarine, which is now still in service with the Canadian Navy, but mainly on nuclear submarines based out of Plymouth. So mainly the Trafalgar class for those that know these things. And you would probably go on a deployment or a patrol for probably average 8 to 10 weeks. I think the longest I dived in any one stretch was 13 weeks. And the longest I did away from home was probably about 7 months when we did a patrol and a trip all into the Red Sea, the Gulf, down to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, and then back to the UK again. And for most of that time, you're living on board, apart from when you go alongside on a port visit. And you work generally in 2 watches. So you do 6 hours on, 6 hours off for the whole time that you're underwater, which that gets pretty tiring after a while, but you're pretty busy. So when you're on watch, certainly as a weapon engineer officer, I used to, one of the reasons why I wanted to join submarines is you're an active member of the operation of the submarine. So you go on the periscope, you do the navigation, you're on ship control, where you're responsible for effectively flying the submarine, its depth, its speed, taking any emergency procedures if you get a flood or a fire or a high pressure airburst or a hydraulic leak or whatever. And then you fire all of the weapons as well. So it's a sort of really hands-on program. And then when you're not on watch, in your 12 hours off, you've got to eat, you've got to do paperwork, you've got to recreate, you do exercise for people that do exercise, and you've got to sleep. So, it's a busy old time.
Amazing. So you're always kept busy anyway, even underwater. And you mentioned about exercise. What was that like in the submarine? I'd say it's different than surface again.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, there were only, certainly the ones I was on, there were like 3 main ways of doing exercise. So there was an exercise bike. There was some weights. You have to be quite careful with weights because submarines have to be very stealthy. You don't want anybody detecting anything. And UK submarines, we spend a lot of money on making them effectively as silent as possible. So what you don't want is somebody like throwing weights around and throwing them on the sort of metal deck and making a noise. So you have like rubber weights and rubber matting, and all submarines have it drilled into them. You've got to be quiet. So, so weights was one. The one I used to do was, there's a rowing machine on board. I now have a sort of like Pavlovian reaction to rowing machines. I can't go on them anymore because it's, that's what I used to spend all my time on. And because you work this 6 hours on, 6 hours off sort of shift rotation, basically you either get up early or you go to bed late, because you can't go on the rowing machine when you're on watch. You're going to do it when you're off watch. So what I used to do is I used to get shaken early, and then I'd go up the ladder from I used to share a cabin with the first lieutenant when I was the head of the weapon engineering department. Turn right past the captain's cabin, and then you go through the reactor tunnel, which actually goes through the reactor compartment. It's got a really big hydraulic door on it. So you pull the handle and it goes and open the door, and then you'd shut the door behind you, and then you walk over the reactor, and then you go to the other side and you open the door and shut it behind you. And then you go into the row machine was in the switchboard room, which was underneath the maneuvering room, where they have all the control panels for all of the reactor and all the systems. So you and you had to book the rowing machine a bit like a squash court. You had to put your name down for it at a particular time. So I go down to the sort of like concept two rower, and it was in between two big switchboards, which is where all the electrical power generated by the submarine was routed through to all of the various pumps and stuff. So there's like, hundreds of thousands of volts going through these two switchboards, and in the middle was a concept two rower, and you strap yourself to it and off you went, start rowing. Sometimes when you're on the rower, we come up to periscope depth, so they put a 10-degree bow up angle on, and you end up rowing uphill, which even Sir Stephen Redgrave doesn't do that. So that was exercise. It's an interesting experience.
Here is another interesting clip from our episode with Steve Kershaw, where he reveals the impact of digitization in the aerospace and defense industry. In the aerospace and defense sector, what has been the impact of digitization, and can you provide a few examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would call two out. So one is the sort of advent of digital twins, which over the last 5 years, I've seen those be adopted much more widely. And personally, I think they're really good and essential for an organization to properly manage and control a very complex environment and program. Because when things get really complicated, it's very difficult for somebody to carry it around in their head. And the interactions between different elements, whether it's supply chain, transport, the physical infrastructure, technology, the actual physical process of manufacturing something, the support arrangements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Getting all of that twinned digitally so that you've got a good feel for what is this program doing, but also what will it do if I do certain things to it. If I speed up the supply chain, for example, if I put more people in and put double shifts on something, what is that going to do to the output? These are all really important but difficult questions to answer in practice. And I think digital twins can really help to do that. So I've seen those be adopted, really well. I mean, some of the work that we're doing in the UK submarine enterprise, for example, there's a lot of digitization of all of that information and bringing out real insights from data that already exists. So that's one I would call out. The other one in aerospace and defense is it's really quite rare these days to have one company or organization delivering a really complicated product like a submarine or an aircraft or a ship or a tank. They're often, if they're not partnered with another firm in the UK, then they're almost certainly partnered with somebody from a different country, because a lot of these big programs are so expensive and complicated. They're actually done by multi-nations. So if you look at the F-35 fighter program, which is probably the biggest defense program globally, obviously it's in the US, but there are partner nations like the UK, build some of the aircraft, for example. The support arrangements are distributed globally. That requires a lot of cooperation across national territories. There's another program which the UK is involved in called GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program, which is the UK, Italy, and Japan. And designing an aircraft of that complexity, a sixth generation fighter across national territories, requires you to share data at a classification that is, doesn't lend itself at the moment to sort of public networks. So that is a complication that other industries arguably don't have. Getting over that is a key challenge, which the things like cloud, etc., can really help with if it's secured in the right way. So that's the sort of second area where I think aerospace and defense in the digital era can really benefit from being able to share data securely across different organizations and different nationalities.
Especially as you just touched on there, like ensuring that encrypted information stays safe. I can imagine in the aerospace and defense industry is a major thing.
Exactly.
And in this next clip, I was joined by Carol Cohn, a trailblazer in the purpose movement and host of the podcast Purpose 360. From her 35 years experience working with many different organizations and leaders, she tells us what leadership traits to be wary of. Is there any traits of a leader to be wary of?
Yeah, arrogance. I mean, arrogance is one, and I'd also, dare I say, and everyone listens, and having a compensation that is in somewhat of alignment with, realistically with employees. Some of these compensation schemes, I'm sorry, that are 100 times more than an employee, that are billions of dollars. I mean, I know Elon Musk is trying to get that, and yes, he set goals, and if he reaches those goals, he's going to get $56 billion. What does someone do with $56 billion? I would like to see them give back to society, but so there needs to be a relative opportunity, both, yes, I'm going to work hard, and it's a hell of a job. It's a tough job to be a CEO these days. It really, really is. You lose a lot of sleep. But if you listen to your employees and you've got humility versus arrogance, they'll follow you. They'll follow you. There's a great, great quote from Fast Company that I always use. And it says, a company without purpose has to manage people and resources. But a company with purpose mobilizes people and resources. And it brings out the human energy that is where creativity, where problem solving comes from. I have lived it. I've seen it. Is extraordinary.
And in this final clip, I was joined by the time boss, Andrew Hartman. In this episode, we discussed how to be more productive with our time, and Andrew gives his take on hustle culture.
Well, you're totally right, Aaron. I think hustle culture is a total lie. I think it is one of the worst things on the internet, truly, because it does not honor that we are whole people well beyond our work, right? I am not successful as a professional if my family breaks down. I am not successful as a professional if I'm unable to contribute in my community or have a life outside of my work, or if my life outside of my work becomes vices and addictions just to help me cope with the stress of work. I mean, that's not a life to live, right? And so I think you said it earlier. One of the biggest issues with productivity is tasks can spawn more tasks. So even if you go into grind mode, there's always going to be more. And even worse, if you go to a grind mode in the context of a company and you develop a reputation for making things happen, but the only way you're making things happen is you're grinding yourself to a pulp, you have entered the most vicious cycle where not only are you dealing with your own expectations, but you're now dealing with other people's expectations. You've literally created a false economy for what's possible. And so I just think we've got to be clear about how much time we have. We've got to be honest with ourselves about what we can actually get done. And then we need to involve the stakeholders in our lives so that they're aware of that too. So that we're all operating on the same economy about what's possible for Andrew, what's possible for Aaron. And if we do that, I think the results will speak for themselves. If we can operate in a pocket where we are not utterly overwhelmed, but there's enough time for us to make great work happen, we will be more creative. We will be more connected to others. We'll seek more interesting solutions. We won't just be in grind mode to get this thing done so we can get to the next thing, The results will actually be better. And it's very counterintuitive. We think if we just shove more in the system, more will be done. But I think what we're actually looking for is outcomes and results. And if that's the case, then I think finding this pocket of execution where certainly like we're loading up the work, we're doing good work, we're working hard, but we're not overwhelming ourselves. That's the key to really powerful productivity.
And that is it. Thank you so much for listening to this bonus episode of the podcast. I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for listening. Thank all of our guests. We've had some amazing conversations on the podcast this year, and we have some amazing guests lined up for 2025. And finally, if you've enjoyed this episode or any of the episodes to date, we would greatly appreciate if you could take the opportunity to give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere that you can consume your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening to the Project Management Paradise podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Project Management Paradise podcast at projectmanagementparadise.com. Your feedback is always welcome. We'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to leave a review. Or you can email your comments or guest suggestions to hello@projectmanagementparadise.com. Finally, if you have not already done so, don't forget to subscribe